So good evening. I'm Gavin Cleespies. I'm the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I'm glad to welcome all of you here, as well as all of the people who are joining us online. For anyone who may be joining MHS for the first time, the Massachusetts Historical Society is the first historical society in America. We date back all the way to 1791. I like to joke that when we were founded, our founding director, Jeremy Belknap, wrote to Paul Revere, and Paul Revere wrote back. We maintain a research library with an amazing collection of material. We hold close to 14 million manuscript pages in our collection that include the papers of 3 of the first 6 U.S. presidents. And as we often do for many of our programs, our chief historian, Peter Drummey, pulled together a small display of material that was on display in the Doust Library. And I hope that those of you joining us in person had a chance to see it. It included drafts of the Massachusetts State Constitution, which our speaker tonight will address. We make these items available to researchers for free, as well as hosting a wide variety of programs and other events. We're only able to host these programs thanks to the support of our donors and members, and we hope that all of you will return for future programs. And we also hope that if you enjoy them, you'll consider becoming a member or a supporter of the Mass Historical Society. This evening, we're happy to welcome Dr. Edward Larson, who will be speaking on his new book, American Inheritance, Liberty, Slavery, and the Birth of a Nation. Dr. Larson is the Hugh and Hazel Darling Chair in Law and is a university professor of history at Pepperdine University. He received the Pulitzer Prize in History in 1998 for his book, Summer for the Gods, The Scope Trials in America's Continuing Debate Over Science and Religion. He has taught at numerous universities, and I find this very impressive. He has also lectured on all 7 continents, which even beats our Zoom audiences. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speaker for this evening.
Thank you so much. And actually, to be precise, I lectured on all 7 continents in 1 calendar year. I have lectured in all of them many times, but all in 1 year. And I want to thank the Massachusetts Historical Society for inviting me out of the blue. And I'm so always happy to come back to Boston, where I spent nearby in Cambridge 3 happy years. And a couple more in Western Massachusetts. Always happy to come back here. And I know this is a very special historical society. There are many great state historical societies, but this is certainly one of them. Now, as I was said, I invited me back because of this book, which has a lot about Massachusetts in. In fact, I was prompting your chief historian of whether it would qualify for your prize for the best book in Massachusetts history. And he demurred. On that respect, though, I recently, on a lark, went on AI, this chat, whatever, and told him to write an introduction for me. Didn't say it was me. And I won prizes I never had won before, but did not win prizes that I did win. It was no connection with reality, except that might be reality, and we might be living in the artificial world. Who knows? Now, although my book addresses themes of current interest, I do want to say to you now, I'm not going to be talking about current events. This is strictly a historical book, covering what and I think most historians generally view as the Revolutionary era of American history, which really starts here, but also in other places with the Stamp Act crisis of 1765, and goes through the American Revolution and through the Constitutional Convention and to the establishment of a settled republic with the First Federal Congress and the Washington administration. That period is what I deal with in this book, not with current events, though it has relevance to it, and I'm happy to address questions related to that. And it ties together what I believe as 2 characteristically late 18th century American themes. The idea of liberty and the institution of slavery. And they weren't always here in America. They weren't always elsewhere. And I call them characteristically American because I believe they were. I don't think they were Western in general or global in general. For example, although the idea of liberty goes back at least to the Greek antiquity, of course, they talked about the concept of liberty, but that's not the way we thought about it. Their ideas of liberty were different than ours. Ours idea really grows out of a confluence, sort of a mixture of English and French Enlightenment, think Rousseau and Locke, for example, having this fictional idea that all people were born free originally in some fictional time and contracted voluntarily together, giving up their liberty to form governments. And then taking that and implanting those concepts, those ideologies, into a New World people, Europeans living in the English colonies, Massachusetts or Virginia or wherever in the New World, English people living there, where they had free land, if you don't count the Native Americans living there, and open opportunity, so that somebody like a Benjamin Franklin, born into poverty and indentured servitude here in Massachusetts, could become one of the richest people in America by leaving and going another place. And so when you combine those two, you end up with this American idea of liberty that I think was actually unique. Now it has spread other places, I'm not saying that, but it was a distinctively American notion of liberty. And you combine it with slavery. Now slavery too, that's existed in many or maybe all cultures from time immemorial. But it wasn't like American slavery. There was no slavery in England at the time of the American Revolution. It didn't exist. You tried to bring an enslaved person into England, they were immediately free. The English air is too pure for an enslaved person to breathe, as they said in court cases. But what developed in the English colonies in the New World, starting with Barbados and carrying up to South Carolina, and then spreading from South Carolina to the other colonies like Virginia, was this institution of chattel slavery, law-bound, legal, with all sorts of rules and laws, where people would be enslaved based on hereditarily enslaved, which wasn't true in slavery in most places. It didn't pass to the children automatically in most places, by the mother, not by the father. So the father could be the owner of the mother, to the children. And then it carried also, it was so legalistic. You know how the way the English think, they process everything, and there were all sorts of rules. It was all law bound. And that sort of chattel slavery didn't exist before. And so that was uniquely American. And suddenly in the revolutionary era, those two ideas come clashing together. The institution of chattel slavery, the American institution of slavery, and the American idea of liberty. And so my book expands on that in a variety of ways, and there's not enough time to talk about it all, but let me pick up some of that with I've sort of picked out pieces that are more connected with Massachusetts. A lot of the book deals with Massachusetts, but I picked out more of them, and I ended up printing it off rather than reading directly from the book to be a little more coherent. But remember what Lincoln said in the Gettysburg Address, and I don't think he was totally wrong, that America as a nation was conceived in liberty. And permit me to explore that of colonies which were originally formed as extensions of Protestant Englishness in a purported wilderness frontier by taking you back, not to the founding, not when John Locke, thinking about liberty, began his great treatise with in the beginning, all the world was America. He recognized the connection there, but to the Stamp Act crisis in 1765 and Boston. The Spreading Elm at the corner of Essex and Orange Street in Boston's Old South End had served as a local landmark for years. At dawn on August 14, 1765, the patriot leader of the South End gang, the shoemaker Ebenezer McIntosh, signaled the start of organized, violent resistance to the Stamp Act by hanging from that tree an effigy of Andrew Oliver with a sign reading, "In praise of liberty." Known thereafter as the Liberty Tree, that elm served as a rallying point for patriots until the British, during the British occupation of Boston, chopped it down. A riotous crowd composed mostly of workers, at least some of whom came with armed with clubs and staves, soon surrounded the tree. Acting at the behest of the Loyal Nine, a clandestine committee of patriot artisans and merchants that soon morphed into the Sons of Liberty under the leadership of Samuel Adams. He would never have been called Sam. And James Otis Jr., McIntosh had united the rival North and South End gangs to make common cause against the Stamp Act. Oliver's brother-in-law, the Loyalist Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson, immediately sensed trouble and directed the sheriff to remove the effigy. Objecting that, and I'm quoting here from his official response, objecting that his officers could not do so without imminent danger to their lives, the sheriff refused. Tensions rose as the day wore on without decisive action. At dusk, the leaders of the swelling crowd, which one local newspaper numbered at, quote, some thousands in a town of under 16,000 people, took down the effigy and with mob in tow paraded it roughly a mile to Oliver's Wharf. There, rioters demolished a new brick building rumored to serve as the future office for administering the tax by Andrew Oliver. With the effigy and kindling from the demolished building, the crowd then passed to Oliver's stately home. After beheading the effigy in plain sight of the house's occupants, protesters set the effigy ablaze in a hilltop bonfire visible across town before storming the house, which Oliver and his family had just vacated. Helping themselves to Oliver's liquor, as we all did before the talk, the rioters broke windows and mirrors, smashed furniture, tore down the fence, and made a general mess of the place. Hutchinson and the sheriff tried to disperse the mob around 11 o'clock, but were driven off by a shower of stones. The next day, to save himself from further injury, Oliver agreed to decline his commission as stamp agent and to do nothing to execute the act. The Stamp Acts, of course, were taxes imposed on printed goods, and the stamp symbolized him, so you had to buy the stamp and stick it on the printed good. Word spread that Hutchinson and agents of the local customs office and admiralty remained committed to enforcing the Stamp Act. The mob turned on them on the night of August 26, invading and trashing the homes of the comptroller of customs, court officers, and the lieutenant governor. The militia finally turned out to help keep the peace after the second night of rioting, but patriot leaders warned Governor Hutchinson against jailing anyone for attacks or more riots would follow. No prosecutions ensued. Francis Bernard, the colony royal governor, holed up in an offshore British fort, let everyone know that he would not press the issue of stamps. The Sons of Liberty ruled Boston. As news of these actions spread from Massachusetts, other mainland British colonies erupted. As Bernard wrote in an official note to his government in London, all the power of the British government shall not oblige them to submit to the Stamp Act. They will die first. As events in Boston suggested, the Stamp Act crisis seeded a new spirit of liberty in the colonies. The British would call it licentiousness. Occurring in 1765, shortly after the tumultuous and disorientating 7 Years' War, or as it was known in America, the French and Indian War, it prompted mainland American colonists to fear for their liberty and prosperity under British rule. It gave substance to widely circulated political conspiracy theories spun by opposition Whig partisans in England and spread by American patriots to implicate Parliament about the supposed absolutist designs of Britain's Hanoverian monarchs, George I, II, and III, to enslave their subjects. Yes, enslave. That's what Addison and Steele, that's what the Whig writers in England, that's the term they used, and Americans adopted with different meaning. It befit the time. And in America, when they heard it, it linked, unlike in England. In England, people, Addison and Steele, the Whigs, were thinking of classical Roman slavery. But in America, it linked their cause, this dream of liberty, this ideal of liberty, with the fact of chattel slavery, because that's what Americans, unlike in England, where there was no, Britons will never, never be slaves. We know that from their song of the day. They didn't have that. We did. And it led, this use of enslaved, led prosperous American lawyers, planners, and merchants from New England and the Carolinas, many of whom owned enslaved Blacks, to express apprehensions that, to use their own oft-repeated racial formulation, I can't believe how many times I read this in letters, that these Americans would not become, quote, Parliament's Negroes. As a result, the Stamp Act crisis of 1765 became a critical step in the march from colonialism to revolution and independence, with liberty as its goal and slavery as its activating metaphor. So let me explain. The Stamp Act crisis rested on a subtle but significant difference in perspective, repeatedly raised in pamphlets and proclamations. Quote from the Pennsylvania Assembly's official resolution defining the Stamp Act. It is the inherent birthright and indubitable privilege of every British subject to be taxed only by his own consent or that of his legal representatives. And anything else would be slavery. By imposing the stamp taxes on them without their consent, taxes, as I've said, envisioned by stamps on all locally produced printed items and written documents, Parliament supposedly enslaved colonists. A Boston essayist writing in a local newspaper sneered at the time in a passage dripping with satire, "You have been told by great authority," meaning Hutchinson, "that a respectful submission is your duty. And so it is with your brother Americans, the Black inhabitants of the West Indies Islands. Their duty is certainly to submit to all the impositions of their masters, for we know they were created for no other end but with the sweat of their brow to support them in luxury." The metaphor of slavery drove home this point. It made it seem real to these Americans. Those British overlords in London saw matters very differently. The English paid stamp taxes too, they noted, and so colonists had a form of virtual representation in having the tax imposed on others who bore a similar one. In any event, these British supporters added, the proceeds offset the cost of colonial administration. Now, these defenses meant nothing to most American colonists who saw the Stamp Act imposed on them without their consent as a direct tax that, while lower than similar ones in England, Parliament could unilaterally raise. And they weren't the same ones as the ones in England. Indeed, that was precisely the goal of British Prime Minister George Grenville, who wanted to establish the principle of absolute parliamentary sovereignty over the colonies, even in tax matters. All this played into the hands of your own James Otis, who had long spoiled for such a flight. He loved fights. A gifted lawyer and popular local politician with a history of opposing British imperial impositions, Otis had the public standing and ready arguments to pounce in 1764, when Parliament announced the forthcoming tax. One of the first pamphlets published in response, and by far the best known and most often reprinted one of all the Stamp Act pamphlets, Otis's The Rights of English Colonies Asserted, denied the right of Parliament to impose any external tariffs or internal taxes solely on unrepresented colonists. And let me read what he wrote in this longer pamphlet, but a key passage. Every British subject born on the continent of America or any other of the British domains is entitled to all of the natural, essential, inherent, and inseparable rights of our fellow subjects in Great Britain. No act of Parliament can deprive them of the liberties of such unless any will contend that an act of Parliament can make slaves, that's underlined, by the way, not only of 1, but of 2 millions, the Commonwealth, which was the estimated American population. No man can take my property from me without my consent. If he does, he deprives me of my liberty and makes me a slave. Well, following Otis's lead, 2 other pamphleteers depicted the Stamp Act as a form of enslavement. I chose them because these were the other 2 most reprinted and best known and often oft-quoted pamphlets of the era. One by the Rhode Island governor, merchant and slave ship owner Stephen Hopkins, and the other by Maryland colonial secretary, the London-based barrister, and the slave plantation owner, Daniel Delaney. Hopkins opened his pamphlets by declaring, "Liberty is the greatest blessing that men enjoy, and slavery the heaviest curse that human nature is capable of. Those who are governed at the will of another, and whose property may be taken from them by taxes or otherwise without their consent and against their will, are in the most miserable condition of slavery." I don't think he asked whether the people on his slave ships from Africa would agree with that. But anyway, while these definitions of liberty and slavery echoed established English usage, like you'd hear from Addison and Steele, Hopkins relied on the ubiquity of chattel slavery in America to give them added political force. More conservative than Hopkins and not a firebrand like Otis, the Cambridge-educated Delaney also gave a proper English meaning to slavery. Perhaps for that reason, his pamphlet carried more weight in London than other colonial tracts. And along with the widespread protests and boycotts that ground tax collections to a halt, was quoted in the debates of Parliament as suggesting that it helped lead Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act in 1766, less than a year after it was imposed. Delaney wrote with pinpoint emphasis, "There may well exist dependency and inferiority without absolute vassalage and slavery. In what the superior may rightfully control and compel, and in what the inferior ought to be at liberty to act without control or compulsion, depends upon the nature of the dependency and degree of subordination." Regarding the degree of subordination, colonies owned Parliament, he argued, external taxes did not cross the limit to enslavement, but internal taxes, like the Stamp Act, did. In accord with Delaney's view of the dependency of the colonies on the mother country, Parliament paired its repeal of the Stamp Act with passage of the American Colonies Act of 1766. This so-called declaratory act avowed that Parliament had full power and authority to make laws and statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the colonies and people of America in all cases whatsoever, That's the text of the statute. As a face-saving words, these might not have mattered, but after Parliament proceeded under them to impose new revenue tariffs on the colonies in 1768 and 1769, the slave trope reappeared with vengeance. Even during the Stamp Act crisis, and more so thereafter, pamphlets by Otis, Hopkins, Delaney did not stand out because they used the metaphor of slavery to assail British imperial policies. That usage was common. They stood out for their impact, which resulted from their effective use of revolutionary rhetoric, particularly the slavery metaphor. A striking yet representative example appeared when, at the height of the Stamp Act crisis in 1765, Massachusetts patriot John Adams, the future conservative American president, inveighed in a public letter against British treatment of colonists. "We won't be their Negroes." Whatever meaning or implications it carried in particular cases, the slavery metaphor worked with white free colonists because they did not want to become like the enslaved Africans in their midst in every colony, in Massachusetts as well as South Carolina. They knew slavery firsthand and rejected it for themselves. Repeal of the Stamp Act had followed Grenville's fall in July of 1765, and his replacement as prime minister by Lord Rockingham, a supporter of constitutional rights for colonists. Rockingham lasted only a year in the post, however. King George never agreed with him. With the Grenville-like Charles Townshend then put in charge of tax policy, Parliament in 1769 passed the so-called Townshend Acts, imposing revenue duties on paper, glass, lead, paint entering the colonies, and of course, tea, the one you know best here. Once again, declaring that taxation without representation violated the rights of British colonies, the colonists erupted anew. Repudiating any distinction between internal and external taxes, patriot propagandists now charged that all revenue measures imposed without their consent solely on them constituted slavery. Effective in challenging the Stamp Act, stamp taxes, use of the metaphor exploded under the Townshend duties. With Otis by then increasingly sidelined by mental illness, Samuel Adams assumed the leading role in Boston's chapter of the Sons of Liberty and the far-reaching committees on correspondence. A gifted polemicist, more than that of any other single person, his became the voice of colonial resistance to the Townshend Acts. He used the slavery metaphor as sharply as Otis ever had. Having previously denounced the Stamp Act and this is Adams, as reducing colonists, quote, from the character of free subjects to the miserable state of tributary slaves, Samuel Adams now turned his fury on the Townshend duties. Slavery, my dear mother, we cannot think of it. We detest it. He wrote in a public letter published in Boston and widely throughout the colonies, but ostensibly written to Britain, the mother country. If this detestation of slavery, if this be a crime, remember we sucked it at your milk. Quoting a popular English ballad that soon became an unofficial British national anthem, Adams then added, Britons will never, never become slaves. Adams carried on in this way into the 1770s, admonishing colonists in his trademark fashion, quote, is it not high time for the people of this country explicitly to declare whether they will be free men or slaves? Now, notwithstanding the overall influence of Adams' work, those of John Dickinson's anonymously published letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania had the greatest impact of any single publication or series of publication in steeling the Americans against the Townshend Act, sort of the role that Otis's document played in the Stamp Act crisis. Ostensibly written by a simple farmer, The 12 letters that appeared first serially in 19 colonial newspapers beginning in 1767, and then together as pamphlets published in 7 cities from Philadelphia to Paris in 1768, they displayed legal acumen and style that engaged readers of all stripes. Born on his father's tobacco plantation in Maryland and raised at the family plantation in Delaware that he inherited, Dickinson also held estates in Pennsylvania through marriage. He worked his land with enslaved blacks, owning more of them than anyone else in the Delaware River Valley. To the delight of patriots and fury of loyalists, Dickinson turned the slavery metaphor against the Townshend Acts in his letters, portraying himself and his ilk as the bondservants of Britain. Dickinson had used the metaphor earlier in assailing the Stamp Act, writing in 1765 as, quote, a gentleman from Pennsylvania. He didn't use his name, he just used that. He had depicted stamp taxes much like a master's leash as, and I'm quoting here, drawing off, as it were, the last drops of their praised blood. Stating, every drop of my blood is British, he rallied against the act that British leaders should, quote, be better pleased having their children speaking the language of free men than muttering the timid murmurs of slaves. The metaphor worked even better when attributed to a humbler hand in letters from a Pennsylvania farmer. The first letter began, my farm is small, my servants are few and good. I have a little money at interest and wish for no more. This opening phrase hardly pointed toward the cool, conservative Dickinson, who had many enslaved servants and much cash on hand. But his fictional farmer could make the metaphor sing for moderate Whigs and white artisans, shopkeepers, and farmers. He wrote in his second letter, the Parliament unquestionably possesses the legal authority to regulate the trade of Great Britain and her colonies. The single question is whether Parliament can legally take the money out of our pockets without our consent. If they can, all of our boasted liberty is but a sound and signifying nothing. We are slaves. In the seventh letter, he declared, those who are taxed without their own consent expressed by themselves or their representatives are slaves. We are taxed without our consent given by ourselves or our representatives. We therefore, I speak it with grief, I speak it with indignation, we therefore are slaves. The Townshend Act reduced colonists, he claimed, to a state of abject slavery. Is it possible to form any idea of slavery more complete, more miserable, more disgraceful than that of a people where justice is administered, government exercised, and a standing army maintained at the expense of the people, yet without the least dependence on them? It was a rhetorical question that he never asked to his own enslaved blacks, and he owned hundreds of them. Read by Southern planters and Northern farmers in New York pubs and London clubs, by colonial elites and the working poor, Dickinson's letters had much the same impact on public debate over the Townshend duties as Delaney's or Otis's pamphlets regarding the stamp taxes. Written from a conservative perspective, both his document and Delaney's crystallized the issue in terms of English liberty versus African slavery and awakened colonists to the patriot cause. From his vast Virginia plantation, George Washington wrote to George Mason early in 1769 after having read Dickinson's pamphlets, letters. At a time when our lordly masters in Great Britain will be satisfied with nothing less than the deprivation of American freedoms and our enslavement, it seems highly necessary that something should be done to avert the stroke and maintain the liberty to which we have derived from our ancestors. Each of these men, Mason and Washington, were the owner of over 100 enslaved blacks. And both having read Dickinson's letters, by mid-1769, Washington and Mason joined the patriot cause by organizing a boycott of British goods by Virginia planters with the goal, in Washington words, of, quote, drawing Parliament's attentions to our rights and privileges by starving their trade and manufacturers. Patriot leaders and other colonists did likewise with remarkable effect. Trade in tax goods plummeted and smuggling soared. Matters only became worse after resistance to the Townshend Acts in Boston led the British to dispatch warships and troops to enforce compliance here, resulting in the Boston Massacre of March 1770. Although the news had not yet reached America yet, in response to ongoing boycotts, Parliament had already largely repealed the Townshend duties. To maintain the principle of its sovereignty, however, Parliament retained the tariff on tea. That, coupled with the outrage over the Boston Massacre, kept the situation in the colonies fluid. With Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and the Committees on Correspondence urging a sustained boycott of British goods everywhere. Into the 1770s, prominent patriots persisted in protesting their enslavement by Britain in passages laced with imagery of African bondage. Washington, for example, complained in June of 1774. Those from whom we have a right to seek protection are endeavoring by every piece of art and on despotism to fix the shackles of slavery upon us. Parliament, he added 2 months later, sought to make colonists, and I'm quoting here, as tame and as abject slaves as the blacks we rule over with such arbitrary sway. In a widely read pamphlet, South Carolina planter William Henry Drayton exclaimed that same year, "It is as clear as the sun at noon that taxation of America by Parliament serves to compel America to bow the neck to slavery. By accepting the Townshend tariffs, John Adams then chided Bostonians in that same year. You would not only, by following it, you would not only be slaves, but the most abject sort of slaves in to the worst sort of masters." With British troops occupying Boston in 1775, Harvard President Samuel Langdon depicted colonist plights as, quote, the vilest slavery known to man. Following Dickinson, a wide array of patriot essayists employed the slavery metaphor. Virginia planter Thomas Jefferson, New York lawyer Alexander Hamilton, Philadelphia writer Thomas Paine, South Carolina merchant Charles Gladstone, and more. No longer merely common, its use became ubiquitous. Words drove the opening phase of the American Revolution, most historians agree, until the violence of it, especially on the western frontier and the southern colonies, became its own driver. John Adams later wrote to Jefferson, "The revolution was in the minds of the people and was effected from 1760 to 1775. The pamphlets and newspapers in all the colonies ought to be consulted during that period to ascertain the steps by which public opinion was enlightened and informed concerning the authority of Parliament over the colonies. For embattled colonists, those revolutionary expiring words featured American liberty as the ultimate good and African slavery as the absolute evil." As the quoted passages I've used also suggest, patriot invocations of liberty and slavery were often not Enlightenment arguments based on abstract notions of free men and a state of nature, as you'd read in Locke or Rousseau. They were intensely emotional appeals that relied for their force on the readers' and hearers' familiarity, personal familiarity with chattel slavery. "There are but two sorts of men in the world," John Adams declared, "free men and slaves. In their mind's eye, Americans were either Dickinson's white yeoman farmers living securely on a bit of investment income, or in a state of abject chattel slavery, living like enchained blacks without recourse or rights. If we accept taxation without representation," Massachusetts orator Joseph Warren warned, "we must admit at once that we are absolute slaves and have no property of our own. Pleas for liberty and warnings about slavery drove the call to arms. These usages never worked better for this purpose than on March 23, 1775, when the spellbinding Virginia orator, country lawyer, and rising plantation slaveholder Patrick Henry stood in an unsanctioned meeting of his colony's assembly to demand armed resistance to ongoing acts of British tyranny, most of which were occurring here in Massachusetts. The question before the House, Henry began, speaking in the third person before shifting to the first, was one of awful moment to this country. For his own part, he considered it as nothing less than a question of freedom or slavery. Shall we acquire the means of effectual resistance by lying supinely on our backs and hugging the delusive phantom of hope until our enemies shall have bound us hand and foot? He asked in a clear allusion to chattel slavery. No, Henry exclaimed, there is no retreat but in submission and slavery. Our chains are forged. Their clanking may be heard on the plains of Boston. Then came that haunting close. Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, God, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but give me liberty or give me death. And how those words, that invocation of African slavery to drive the fight for American liberty, played out for the actual institution of chattel slavery in America, then in place at the beginning of the Revolution in every colony from New Hampshire to Georgia. Well, not much changed in the South, where slavery was undergirded the economy. But much did change in the North, where free and enslaved Blacks readily joined patriot calls for liberty, made them their own, and to a great extent fought with white colonists to advance the cause of their own liberty and liberty in general. In every New England colony, local Blacks served in the Patriot militia at a higher percentage than local whites, with enslaved Blacks inevitably emancipated for their service. Black soldiers fought and died at Lexington and at Concord and at Bunker Hill and every other major Northern engagement. When the Virginia plantation owner George Washington took command of New England forces besieging Boston in the fall of 1775, he initially tried to purge it entirely of Black troops, issued an order to that effect, but soon reversed that order because of widespread public opposition and the realization that he didn't have enough troops without the Blacks. Every New England state relied heavily on local Blacks to fill their quota of troops throughout the Revolution, with Rhode Island fielding an entire Black regiment. Indeed, the Revolutionary War was the last time in American history where Blacks fought shoulder to shoulder with whites until the Korean War. And here in the North, particularly in Massachusetts, but throughout New England and the North, and certainly Pennsylvania as well, the metaphor of slavery mattered for Blacks who took up the cause themselves, and for whites who, a significant number of them, accepted the hypocrisy of not combining the two causes. Think back to that speech I quoted, that pamphlet I quoted from James Otis, that incredibly important pamphlet issued in 1764 against the Stamp Act. After the passage I quoted, quote, that no man can take my property from me without my consent. If he does, he deprives me of my liberty and makes me a slave. He then added, the colonists are by law of nature freeborn, as indeed all men are white or black. That was Otis's words in that pamphlet. A group of free and enslaved blacks led by Felix Holbrook, and you have that petition out there, one of them, soon followed Otis's pleas with a series of 3 petitions to the Massachusetts Assembly and one to the governor asking for an end of slavery. Quote, "We pray for such relief, which to us will be life from the dead." A print edition of those publications rebuked white patriots for this people to be talking of liberty and at the same time to be importing and making slaves of whole cargoes of their fellow creatures is a hypocrisy of language. All people who ever inhabit within the province should enjoy the same liberties. Caesar Sartor, a free black living north of Boston, drew on these freedom petitions to publish an address in the local newspaper, uniting the cause of American and African liberty. Born free in Africa, transported as a youth to America, and enslaved for 2 decades before regaining his freedom, Sartor addressed his appeal to slaveholders in Massachusetts. "At this time of great anxiety and distress among you on account of the infringement of the natural rights and privileges of freeborn men, permit me to tell you about slavery and liberty. As slavery is the greatest and consequently most dreaded of all temporal calamities, so is the opposite liberty the greatest temporal good." Turning their rhetoric against them, he asked white patriots, "Now, if you are sensible that slavery is in itself and in its consequences a great evil, why will you not pity and relieve the poor, distressed, enslaved Africans?" Sartor linked the cause of white patriots to that of their enslaved servants. Quote, "Would you desire the preservation of your own liberty? As a first step, let the oppressed African be liberated." The Revolutionary Agitation in Massachusetts led in 1780 to a new state constitution, printed out there, affirming at its beginning that all men are born free and equal. The first constitution in America to explicitly abolish slavery. But it took lawsuits by enslaved blacks to make those words a reality. And most of you in Massachusetts know these stories. One involved a woman known as Mum Bet, Elizabeth Freeman, as she took after her freedom. By 1781, the wife of John Ashley, Bet's owner, had hit Bet one too many times, the last time leaving a lasting scar from a scalding hot fire shovel. Bet went to court. "I've heard that paper read yesterday," referring to the reading of the Constitution, state constitution, "that says all men are born equal." She asked a local white lawyer, "Won't the law give me my freedom?" He agreed to take her case and argued it squarely on the state constitution. It worked. The local trial jury found for Bet, and Ashley did not appeal. A pair of cases from 1783 involved Cork Walker were given even more importance at the time. Unlike Bet's case, a former owner had promised to free Walker when he reached the age 25. That owner died before Walker reached 25, however, and Walker passed to the owner's son-in-law, Nathaniel Jennison, who refused to honor the promise. Walker left anyway. After Jennison pursued, beat, and kidnapped him, Walker sued Jennison for injuries, and the state indicted Jennison for criminal assault. Everything turned on whether Walker remained enslaved to Jennison because under Massachusetts law, a slaveholder was not liable for injuring his own property. Unremarkably, this would have been normal at the time. The jury found for Walker based on his prior owner's promise, and Jennison did not press the appeal. The criminal case against Jennison proceeded to the Supreme Judicial Court in 1783, however, where Chief Justice William Cushing instructed the jury regarding Walker's status, quote, "The idea of slavery is inconsistent with our state constitution." Under that document, he had admonished the jury, slavery, quote, "is as effectively abolished as it can be." And so liberty expanded in a revolutionary era, at least in the North. Liberty, if not equality. America's first great emancipation occurred during the Revolutionary era, when led by this state and Pennsylvania, the North ended slavery. America's second emancipation came with the Civil War, when troops, including the fabled 54th Massachusetts Regiment of Black Soldiers, ended slavery in the South. America's third emancipation came during last century's civil rights movement. But as we all know and are reminded of almost daily, the fight for liberty is never finished because its full idea is never realized. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm sure Dr. Larson would be happy to take questions.
What is Roman slavery?
Oh, Romans enslaved conquered peoples. And so as long as they were in their first 500 years, conquering new lands, starting with the Etruscans and later the Greeks, they would enslave the captured people. It would not be hereditary slavery. They would enslave those they captured, but their children would not be enslaved. So it didn't matter who the father was, in other words.
We have a question online from Robert who asks, what was the impact of the discourse between Northern Blacks who have fought for ideals of liberty versus Southern Blacks who did not fight for those ideals? Did this incite events of insurrection after the end of the war?
A good question. It does to an extent, but what happened in the South was because in the North, virtually every colony, I think it was true, every colony, of course, during the war, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Vermont end slavery during the war. The others follow soon thereafter. But all of them enlist Blacks as soldiers, free and enslaved. And the enslaved ones are automatically given their freedom on the end of their tenure in service. I mean, they have to serve their regulated time. But that includes Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, New Jersey, and of course, they had ended slavery in the other northern states. The South would never give arms to Africa. They just wouldn't. They would not. They might use them as workers, but they would never include them in the militia. So there wasn't that route that you had in all the northern states to emancipation. So in the North, the normal phenomena is not universal in New Jersey or New York, but the normal phenomena is Africans in the North, because I couldn't find a single African who wanted to remain enslaved. I mean, I couldn't find them. They heard this rhetoric too, and they're all feeling this. I mean, I found some silence, but I never found anyone who wanted, oh no, I want to continue to be enslaved. In the North, they could run to the Patriot armies, or they could just get their freedom, or they could move to Massachusetts where they'd be free. But in the South, they didn't have that route. So what the British did in the South, beginning with Dunsmore's proclamation, but much more importantly, when Clinton issued the Pittsburgh Proclamation, that any enslaved Black enslaved by a patriot, so George Washington's enslaved, it wouldn't apply to loyalists, but anyone enslaved by a patriot or a neutral, if that enslaved person fled their master and joined the British, came behind British lines, they were free. Now, the justification for that was the same as the Emancipation Proclamation. You're in the Civil War. You're weakening your opponent by taking their enslaved property. And so what would happen is the second half of the Revolution, as you probably know, the British give up on Massachusetts and evacuate Boston. They moved to New York for a while, but then they focus after the Battle of Saratoga, they focus on the South, and they send army after army down into the South, to Savannah, to Charleston, and then they march around, led by Clinton or Cornwallis at different times, Benedict Arnold after he became a traitor, led their armies, and they'd march around in Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia, burning homes and trying to capture the land. They thought there would be more loyalists there, But they also thought the South was more important to their economy because it was a plantation economy and they could use the rice and tobacco and whatever. But what you found is as the troops marched around, these blacks would leave their plantations. I mean, dozens left Mount Vernon. Scores left Jefferson's plantation. Everyone left Payton, the plantation who was head of the Continental Congress who lived in Williamsburg. They left Drayton's plantation. They left Pinckney's plantation. By the thousands, they fled. And their route to freedom was get behind British lines, many times serving as volunteers working with the British Army. But even if you didn't, I mean, that was a job, you were free. And so they would then follow the British Army and what they would do. So the route to freedom in the South was joining the British Army or getting behind British lines. And the British then, as the British lost, as they concentrated into Savannah, Charleston, and New York, their final redoubts, especially after the Battle of Yorktown, the blacks came with them. And so there were large numbers of formerly enslaved blacks, including many enslaved blacks of Jefferson and Washington, behind lines in New York City and Charleston and Savannah. And to the British credit, even though Henry Lawrence insisted that the peace treaty, they would have to go back, the British didn't do it. The British took them with them. So they would take them to Nova Scotia, they'd take them back to England, they'd resettle them in Africa, that was their choice. And so the route to freedom in the South was going to the British lines because they were not getting it from the patriots in the South. Not that there was nobody in the South who was not advocating. John Lawrence, Henry Lawrence's son, aide de camp to Washington, called for building a battalion of African and giving them their freedom in South Carolina. But his proposal got nowhere with the legislature. And so you had a different dynamic occurring in the North and the South. But there was a route to emancipation during the Revolutionary era in both places. It was joining the Patriots in the North. It was joining the British in the South.
Yeah, I'm just, these aren't really questions, or just kind of comments, which I think demonstrates the kind of frightening relevance of the things you're talking about to the rather sorry state of affairs in this country now. The first is appropriation. And it's wonderful to see how it's not really the founding fathers, but the leaders of the revolution were able to say, slavery, that's really awful. It's horrifying. Oh, we're being enslaved. Take that. Ignore the experience don't deal with that stuff. That's all too difficult. But let's take the narrative and let's use slavery and dress up our experience. And you even called out, whoever the chap was saying, what could be worse than my experience of my taxes being taken unfairly? Well, there's a long list on that could be worse. So that appropriation, we certainly have a long tradition of that. Secondly, and it's even more disturbing to me, is you opened your remarks with reference to Locke and Rousseau and about the concept, this lovely world in which free men come together and decide to pool their efforts and to surrender some of their liberty on behalf of to each other and share that so they can make a society work. And if there's anything that today demonstrates what we don't do, it's that. Look at COVID, look at guns, look at all the things, absolute freedom, and devil take the hindmost in terms of the impacts. I'm not looking to get into a debate about this because it's just catastrophically depressing, but you've referenced these themes and boy, are they still there.
For you, just picking up on what you're saying, when John Meacham reviewed my book in the New York Times, and his take-home conclusion, which I hadn't expressed, but it's similar to what you expressed, is the takeaway I take from Larson's book is that everyone knew slavery was wrong. And it hadn't expressed, because that was not true by the end of the Revolutionary era, because I go up to the 1790s, and by the 1790s, the Pinckneys, the people in the South, even Jefferson in his Notes of Virginia, they're quaffling on whether it's wrong. But his conclusion was, at least during the Revolutionary era, everyone knew it was wrong. And I have a lot of respect for John Meacham. So if that's what he took from my original sources, I'm not saying it's wrong, but it fits with what you're saying. But what the book totally shows on the other side is that at the time, no one thought slavery was expiring on its own forces. Yes, in the North, but they all knew that slavery was deeply entrenched in the South. And by the Constitutional Convention, those few people who went to the Constitution from the North, maybe your Elderbird jury, who might have had some fond dreams that slavery was on its waning, by the time they got done listening to the Pinckneys and listening to James Madison, they were convinced that slavery was here to stay.
Well, I want to thank Professor Larson for a wonderful talk. I know there's lots of other questions and there are books available, and I believe Professor Larson will be out there signing them, and you can ask your questions then. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.